I think there's a lot of value in taking that time and effort and energy toward understanding what's going on in your body so that then when you do come across the next thing that's going to help you extend your longevity or is going to fully heal whatever issue you're dealing with, we have a clearer picture that we can fit that into. And, I think on the baseline, we want to start with skepticism and try to really understand even the basics of what this compound might do or what this intervention might do so that then we can determine, does this actually make sense in terms of how our bodies work?
Welcome to The Body Never Lies. I'm your host, Leela Lutz. Each week, myself and experts from around the world help you uncover the secret ways your body communicates with you to empower you in your own individual health journey.
I'm so thrilled to have the incredible Jay Feldman back on the show. In this episode, Jay and I are diving deep into the world of biohacking, exploring the science, the hype, and the reality behind some of the most popular biohacking trends, from ice baths and fasting to low-carb diets and muscle building. We leave no stone unturned. Jay brings his wealth of knowledge and research-backed insights to challenge some of the mainstream health ideals that we've come to accept. We unpack the complexities of metabolism, stress, and energy production, getting to the heart of what truly supports long-term health and vitality. Whether you're a seasoned biohacker or just curious about optimizing your well-being, this conversation is packed with thought-provoking perspectives that are sure to shift the way you approach your health. So sit back, get ready, take some notes, and let's dive in. Jay Feldman, I'm so excited to have you back on the show again. You've been on a couple of times and the audience has just loved you, especially the male listeners. I'm so excited to have you back. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Layla. I'm happy to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about biohacking. And this was something that we kind of touched on in one of your previous episodes and when we were talking about men's health, but we said we'd come back to it and dive deeper into it. So I'm excited to do that with you today. Biohacking, hey, it's still a big thing, right?
Yeah, I don't think it's gone anywhere. If anything, it's just growing, right?
It's just growing and growing and growing. What would you define biohacking to be? I mean, the way it's sold.
Sure. I think we can have a more generous definition and then maybe a more accurate definition.
Yeah.
So I think the more generous one is like using different techniques, different technology to try to improve our health and measuring health, measuring aspects of our internal and external environment and trying to improve upon it. And that can mean adjusting diet. It can mean getting, better sleep. It can mean different therapies like red light therapy. It can mean meditation. Like that can be, I think, a broader scope of how biohacking is considered. And of course, I think that's trying to be healthy. But I think the essence of biohacking, and especially if you think about the word itself, it's more so, and I think this is kind of the more accurate way to describe it, is just that this idea that like you can hack into your biology and make it do things that it's not naturally doing already or that it doesn't naturally want to do. And we're going, and using maybe like unnatural or uncommon interventions to do that. And this is, I think, a way that we can get into some trouble. We can do things that we're supposed to be doing in the name of health because some pathway is associated with some outcome. So we're going to take some medication or supplement or do some intervention to activate that pathway. But that doesn't always translate. It often does not translate to the actual outcome we're looking for. And so that's, I'm sure we'll be focusing a bit more on is that side of things that we need to be really careful with.
I think the word that I think of synonymous with biohacking is longevity, right? And anti-aging. Like you're trying to almost stop the clock of stress and what stress is doing to your body and compete with that in a sense and make yourself younger and more stress resilient, stress tolerant. And I think, of course, as a human, why wouldn't you want to do that, right? We're not saying that people doing that are doing anything wrong by having that. That's a human need, I would say, to, enhance your performance and get more out of life. And but I guess what we want to talk about today is, are these things actually really working? And are they really increasing longevity? And the science aspect is always interesting, right? Because I find your website really interesting as well because you really go through the detail of the studies that you've read and link all the studies and stuff. And quite often on social media and whatnot, people are just saying, well, the science says this. And I'm like, okay, well, where's the science? What study did you read? And maybe that's something even interesting to talk about. Like when we read science, what are we looking for, Jay? Like how do we know if science is legit?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question, and it's kind of an area that we need to be careful because even if we are citing a study, that doesn't mean that we are applying it in a realistic way, or there we can take a line from a study to mean something. So we can misuse them as well. And kind of like a lot of things, a little bit of knowledge is sometimes more dangerous than none. And it can be, I think it's really helpful to dig into the research, dig into the physiology. And if you feel like you fully understand something very quickly, then it's probably a good sign that you haven't dug deep enough yet,
Mm.
because there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of intricacy, things are detailed, and in science, there's nothing is proven, right? We try to quote disprove certain hypotheses and provide evidence for other hypotheses, but we're just pointing in a direction and putting pieces together. And so I think we really want to be careful about um, any large claims, but claims especially that are made in a very authoritarian way, a very absolute way, as if there isn't room for gray area or spectrum or nuance. I think that's something to be aware of. I think that I think it's also something where we do have more access to the information than we ever did before. So it's also opening the doors to us learning, which is great. And I think that's one of the more important things too, and more empowering things, is that each of us can take time to learn to the extent that we can, and that's going to be different for everybody. But I think there's a lot of value in taking that time and effort and energy toward understanding what's going on in your body, so that then when you do come across the next thing that's going to help you extend your longevity or is going to fully heal whatever issue you're dealing with, we have a clearer picture that we can fit that into. And I think on the baseline, we want to start with skepticism and try to really understand even the basics of what this compound might do or what this intervention might do, so that then we can determine, does this actually make sense in terms of how our bodies work? And is this actually a pathway we want to be activating, when other things that, activate this pathway, or the reason for this pathway, is because it helps us survive under times of extreme stress or something like that. So, um, yeah, it's tricky nowadays. There's tons of information. I think slowing down and maybe trying to dig in a little bit on your own helps a lot. Maybe trying to turn off some of the channels of information you're getting, at
Yeah,
least for a period of time, can help as well, because it's noisy.
it is noisy. And I noticed too with social media, even I know after I finish this podcast with you, we're going to talk about a few different topics. And I'm going to go open my Instagram later and it's going to start funneling me everything that we've been talking about. So if I was a person who was, I'm really desperate to change something with my health, I don't know what to do, but I've been talking about this with my friend, it sounds really good. And then all of a sudden I open my phone and it's just coming at me from my phone, and you can start to really think that it's a good idea, right?
Of course.
So yeah, it's about getting out of that echo chamber as well, which unfortunately social media is. So let's touch on, I think, like the biggest ones. I guess the first one I want to touch on is ice baths. This has like taken over the internet, I feel like, at the moment. Ice baths and cold plunging. Celebrities are doing it. So many people are doing it. To me, I'm lucky that I found out about thermogenesis before I ever tried one. But do you know what? For me, the thought of being cold, I just like it. So I'm just lucky. I've always been someone that's had cold hands and cold feet, and we'll talk about that why. So the thought of jumping into a bucket of ice does not entice me whatsoever. But let's talk about cold plunging in ice baths.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and when you know how important it is to have high body temperature, the idea of doing something like that doesn't make so much sense. So Yeah, it's nice to have that framework before hearing something like that. But yeah, there's some claims out there about the ice baths, I don't even, like 10 times as much fat burning, and you burn 30 times as many calories and whatever else. There's all those sorts of claims. Um, some pretty ridiculous things. Yeah, I think if and there is a kernel of truth, of course, there's a kernel of truth to all these sorts of claims. It's true that your body wants to maintain homeostasis in terms of its temperature. Ideally, that thermostat is set pretty high, right? We want to have a good high body temperature. If we then put ourselves in a very, very cold environment, our bodies don't like that. We can't live. I mean, hypothermia would take on, pretty soon. And so we have to react to that and try to increase our body temperature. And so that's what our bodies do in that state, right? They're trying to fight the super cold environment that we're putting it in. So, in order to do that, it activates all of our stress systems dramatically, right? We get this flood of adrenaline, cortisol as well, neurotransmitters that are also going to help on the stress side, kind of try to help us get through this experience without feeling as bad as we might. And those things will dramatically increase our metabolic rate during that short period of time. And if the extent of our understanding of physiology is just burn more calories, be healthier, that makes a lot of sense. But things are a little bit more complex than that. There's a little bit more going on, and we don't want to just burn calories regardless of the reason why, or independent of any sort of benefit. Burning calories in and of itself is not just a good thing. If you take your car and throw it in neutral and step on the gas pedal, it's not like good for the engine or good for the car to just be running through all this fuel. So instead, what we are doing is we're causing a pretty intense burst of stress that, and we're increasing these stress hormones, and we then have to recover from that. And we should be able to recover from stress, but that doesn't mean that it's a good thing. That doesn't mean that we want to be encouraging stress or inducing some sort of intensely stressful state just so that we recover from it, just to burn calories, or just to get surges of adrenaline. Instead, these are the exact signals that over time interact with the kind of the glands and regulators of our metabolism and tell our bodies to turn their metabolism down. That's what stress does. We're like very attuned to that because our it helps us to survive and thrive in the right environments. And so if we're in a chronically intensely stressful environment, we will turn down our metabolic rate by turning down our thyroid hormone production and conversion, turning down our reproductive hormone production. And one ice bath on its own, of course, is not going to cause that. But doing that on a consistent basis, or even just at all, is adding to that bucket that is telling our bodies that it's in a stressful environment. Other things that we do, and I'm sure we'll talk about other ones like fasting and low carb and very intense exercise or fasted exercise or coffee on an empty stomach and all sorts of other things also add to that bucket. And it's not a threshold issue where you just hit a threshold and all of a sudden things crash. I mean, that can happen, but it's a gradient issue. And the more stress that's going in there, the more our body is saying, we're not in a good environment. Let's turn our metabolic rate down along with all of our other functions, right? We don't have all this excess energy to use for good digestion and brain function and reproduction and detoxification processes and immune function. We turn those things down in the same way that we would if we were on a very low calorie diet or doing excessive exercise or anything else like that. And so essentially the cold thermogenesis is just a intense burst of stress that's contributing to that same bucket.
Mm. And I would say like most of the clients I see, and obviously I see clients who are pretty stressed because that's my expertise and probably the same for you. The clients that I see have super low body temperature anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because some of the studies used to not that I want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I've seen people talk about the benefits of ice baths and talk about how it'll increase longevity, and they'll cite a study where it's on rats, and they do the exact opposite. They put the rats in a really warm environment, and the rats decrease their body temperature a little bit to compensate, and they live longer. And so then they'll say, oh, low body temperature is good, so we should be putting ourselves in a really cold environment. And it's literally the exact opposite of the intervention that's used in the study.
Wow, that's so interesting. Wow, so you have to really like look through the finite detail. of these things, right? When you're reading the studies. So maybe that's a good reason to talk about, like, because I always say to people, look, don't just take my word for it, right? You have to research it yourself. You can't take anyone's word for anything. You have to look into it. And sometimes for people, it will be even, okay, we'll test it. Test it. So if someone was to test, is an ice bath a good thing for me? What would you suggest?
Yeah, and it is a tricky one, right? Like coffee on an empty stomach or some of the low carb diets. And I guess we'll hold off on the low carb side because there can be other reasons why that can be beneficial. But when we're talking about coffee on an empty stomach, it will give you energy, right? Maybe
Mm,
not good, smooth, relaxed energy, more jittery, anxious energy, but it'll help you have a really good workout and get you through the day, even though you haven't eaten. That doesn't mean that it's going to help you in the long run. And so the same thing can happen with ice baths, right? I mean, you're going to feel like a rush when you do it and after, and um, you're going to get this surge of adrenaline. And especially if we're coming from a low metabolic place, it can feel really good to have everything turn on. But that doesn't mean it's not coming at a long-term cost. So it is a tricky one when it comes to testing. And of course, you can test it and see how's your energy the rest of the day? Are you able to sleep well at night? How's your energy the next day? How's your appetite? How's your mood? But again, it can be a little tricky because some of these things can feel good short term, but can be coming at a long term cost.
mm. I mean, would you use like taking your own body temperature, right? Because the premise is that you should be able to get your body temperature back. Is that part of it? You're trying to you put your what's the word? Exposing yourself to cold, and you're trying to force your body to get back to its own temperature, really, by upregulating the system. So I guess testing your temperature after the ice bath and seeing how long it takes to come back to normal body temperature.
Yeah. Well, and also just test your baseline temperature, right? So the next day, check where your body temperature is in the morning. And assuming it's not increasing, showing that your metabolic rate is increasing in a healthy way, and instead it's most likely going to be on the lower end, that's a good sign that this isn't actually contributing to a good long-term result. Instead, it's suppressing our metabolism.
But people will do it, Jay, and they say, but I feel good all day. I mean, my husband has a cold shower every morning. It's not to that extreme. I think there's a place for having cold showers. And he swears by them. He says that it just sets me up for the day. I feel amazing. I will say that he has a full breakfast of like 700 calories before he does that. Um, so the context is really important, but also it's 2 minutes in cold water, which is probably what, I don't know, 20 degrees Celsius. It's not that cold. But there I can understand how some people are like, but they would be like, Jay, I feel so good though when I do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. I think I wouldn't be so concerned about a 2 minute cold shower like that, especially in a fed state and everything. We're talking about totally different animals here.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so using something like some of those other parameters, right? Checking your basal body temperature before you do the ice bath, checking in the morning, seeing where it is getting later in the day, and then some of those other parameters about how we're feeling could all be some good ways to identify in the short term if it is actually helping us. But I think it's also one of those things where, and as we're kind of as we've talked about, something that is fancy and works for fancy sounding reasons like increasing autophagy or um, you know upregulating fat burning and things like that. We want to be wary of those things, and we don't want to hop into trying them just because there are these claims about them, and that's because they can, again, maybe feel good short term but come at a long term cost. And so we don't necessarily want to have to wait until we feel that long-term cost. Of course, you and I work with a lot of people who are on the other end of that, right? And libido might be down, sleep is a struggle, anxiety. We're seeing low sex hormones and blood tests, and low thyroid hormones, and impaired thyroid hormone conversion, and low energy and mood, and all of that. So ideally, we'll stop before we get down that road.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, and testing body temperature, I always say to people too to be careful because I get a lot of people who test their body temperature orally. And I find that some people who are really stressed can actually have really high oral temperatures and misconceive that, oh, well, I'm fine because actually my oral temperature. I took my temperature. It was, 98, 37 Celsius. But when they take their armpit temperature, it's much, much lower, like 2 degrees, like 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius lower. Can you explain that a little bit as well so people are doing the right measure?
Yeah, well, so it is there can be that tricky aspect with body temperatures that it will increase based on a good metabolic rate, but it'll also increase from stress hormones. So there are, I think, a good way to test it because, we could wake up in the morning and we can have high cortisol at that point, and that can artificially raise our temperature. But one of the best ways to identify whether it's high due to stress or not is that we can then test our temperature about 30 minutes after eating, especially making sure that we're eating breakfast with some carbohydrates, since those are really important for turning down the stress hormones. We can assume that after we've eaten a good meal that feels good for us and has enough calories, has enough carbs, that'll turn down our stress hormones. And so if our body temperature goes down after eating, then that's a pretty clear sign that the body temperature reading we had before eating was artificially elevated due to stress. We were under stress hormones at that point. And so, yeah, that's normally the technique I would recommend for parsing that out.
Yeah, 100%. And sometimes you'll see that some people eat and they'll actually get worse temperatures.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really common in the morning, right? If
Mm,
someone especially struggles with sleep or is coming from low calorie, low carb, over exercising, anything like that, dealing with high morning cortisol, high waking cortisol, it's really common to then see the temperatures go down after eating.
yeah, 100%. So it's like the food has either quietened the system or the system is like, I actually can't deal with the food and now I'm stressed.
No, well, yeah. And both are possible. Ideally, we're eating good food that we digest well, that has a lot of, good carbohydrates and a good carb to protein ratio, and that's going to turn down the stress hormones, ideally. If we're eating something, and here's the other possibility that can come into play here. If we're eating something that we don't do well with and is causing intestinal irritation or something like that, it can, that there can then be other variables that affect the temperature going up or down. So it's not always as clear as it could be. There are other possible variables here, but typically it helps. Typically, it's a good
Mm.
way to identify if the stress hormones are at play.
And I really like using body temperature and pulse. We can talk about using them in conjunction together, but because you know, it's really cheap and
Yeah.
totally accessible with someone. Like something I really hate about the health and wellness industry is everything is so expensive. I mean, like, how expensive is it to go and set up your own ice bath or go to a clinic and consistently have ice baths for your health? Health shouldn't be something that's only for rich people.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm sure some of the other things we'll be talking about will fit into that category. And not to mention, I think there's like when it comes to measurements, right? Frequent blood tests and aura rings and CGMs, not only can they be expensive and cost prohibitive, not to say that we should never use those things, they can be helpful tools, but I think an overemphasis on them and an overemphasis on quantifying everything can also detract from the simple things that we can do to identify how we're feeling, which are sometimes more important, right? Tuning into how we feel on a moment to moment basis.
Mhm.
How's our digestion? How's our mood? Are we dealing with brain fog? How's our sleep? Are we waking up during the night? Are we having trouble falling asleep? We can get so much information without needing to quantify everything with expensive testing or devices.
Mm. Yeah. I want people to really know that to keep it simple is the best. Keep it simple and affordable as well. Put your money into organic food.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's
And
not
people
cheap
get
these
this,
days.
it is not cheap. I'm just blown away when I go to the supermarket or get my organic order every week. The next one I say that tell me feels really good is fasting,
Mm,
and especially fasting in the morning. And I'll get people who tell me, don't eat till 11, 12. But interestingly as well, I just renovated my house and I had a whole bunch of tradies working on my house and my electricians were really into intermittent fasting.
mm,
And I was having a chat about it with them because it was super interesting. So they would train with their trainer at like 5:30 in the morning, and then they would drive and start work at 7 o'clock. And I had a particular problem with this electrician because he'd be standing there talking to me at like 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and he'd be so vague. I'd have to keep repeating myself over and over. And I go, have you eaten today? And he'd be like, no, 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 I'm fasting. Like, I've got to get rid of this body fat. And I'm like, but you can't understand what I'm saying. You've just vagued out. So it was really interesting. And over the course of the build, I was like, maybe you should just try having breakfast, like see how you feel. And he was
Yeah.
actually trying it. He was like, oh, I actually feel so much better. He didn't want to stick with it though. He was really concerned about losing weight. And to be funny, he was actually one of the worst traits that I had working on my job. I just could not ever get him to remember what I said. He was really disorganized. He was really spacey. And he hadn't always been that way. He'd been a recommendation from someone. So once upon a time, he was actually really on the ball. So I found this really interesting. But anyway, intermittent fasting is a really popular thing as well. And people will say at first that they feel amazing. They're like, at work, I'm focused, I'm concentrating, I'm getting a lot of stuff done. Like, explain this to people because it's just also really popular.
Totally. Yeah. So there are, I would say, unlike ice baths, I do think there are aspects of intermittent fasting that can be legitimately beneficial, but that still doesn't mean it's our best tool. So there are a couple aspects of intermittent fasting. For one, when we go for a period without eating, that ends up being inherently stressful. We don't have fuel coming in, and the main way we regulate that is through our blood sugar. So as our blood sugar drops, our stress hormones begin to increase, beginning with glucagon, then epinephrine, and then cortisol. And those break down different tissues or fuels in order to provide the glucose and also start to shift us toward burning more fat in order to spare the glucose. And these are our normal stress hormones. This is a normal process, doesn't mean it's an ideal or optimal process when it comes to health. As we were saying earlier, these stress hormones actually come at a cost to our metabolism in the long term. So when this happens, I mean, if we were to go, let's say, 10 hours without eating, or let's say we, are doing an overnight fast and then through morning and skipping breakfast, it's well known that our stress hormones will spike in the morning. And if we don't then bring them down by eating something, they'll stay elevated in different amounts, the glucagon, adrenaline, and cortisol. But we have to rely on those to provide fuel. That's where we get the fuel from if we're not eating it. And so just like the ice baths, there's a cost to that metabolically, and in the long term, will definitely have negative effects in terms of our reproductive hormones, thyroid hormones, and everything downstream of that, which is like everything. In the short term, we might feel a little bit better from having those stress hormones, although some people don't necessarily feel better, as you were kind of mentioning, right? Maybe spacey, brain is on and you feel like you have energy, but maybe not functioning so well, maybe some fogginess or something like that. That can happen. There is, I would say, really one primary reason why fasting can actually be legitimately beneficial, not through the stress hormones. And that's that we basically provide a lot of relief from our gut. So if we have an unhealthy microbiome and we're eating foods that are feeding these overgrowths of pathogenic bacteria, let's say, those are producing various toxic things. Lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, which is also known as endotoxin, is one of the most common ones and well-known ones that causes intense inflammation and can cause sepsis and death in large enough amounts if we have a severe infection. And we basically see low levels of endotoxin in all sorts of chronic health diseases, chronic health conditions, and we see it in diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and neurodegenerative conditions, fatty liver. There's a huge endotoxin is a huge culprit here, and that's seen across these conditions. So if we take someone who's producing a good amount of endotoxin and then we have them not eat a meal that would increase the production of endotoxin by feeding bacteria, that can feel better. We can have relief from basically the harm that we're doing by feeding an unhealthy gut. And so that can be very, very beneficial. Endotoxin is hugely problematic, and that can lead to a lot of benefits. It can lead to weight loss. It can lead to, better energy and things like that. However, it still comes at that stress cost that we were talking about. And so, as I'm sure we'll kind of circle around to later on, there are better ways that we can reduce the endotoxin. There are better things that we can do that don't come at the cost of stress that will provide that same benefit. And that's where I would want to go. That's what I would recommend doing as opposed to something that we know is going to be coming at a long-term cost.
Mm. And you'll see it, I think. And again, it's another one to test, right? Like I actually, you know, for the simple days that you have to do a fasted blood test, for example, I actually did this on my stories once. I really struggle with fasting. And I think if you're someone like me who has really compromised metabolic health, because I did all of these biohacking things, experimented on myself a lot.
Mhm.
Um, I just can't handle fasting. But it's interesting. So I went for a blood test. So it's not actually that long a fast, right? People think it's not that long a fast. I wake up, I don't know, six in the morning, and then the blood clinic opens at 9 a.m. So, and I'm like the first person there. So for 3 hours of fasting, but then obviously I have to walk home, and then have breakfast. It was really interesting testing my temperature and pulse on that day, actually waking up with okay temperature and pulse, and then testing it in the fasted state before I had the blood test, and it had dropped quite low and had a really elevated pulse. And then when
Mhm.
I finally got home and ate breakfast, it was worse. It wasn't, I didn't get an alleviation from eating food. And I think this is the thing too, where people go, well, I ate breakfast and it actually made me worse, so I'm going to fast longer. Whereas the feeling that I had in my body was, I used to fast, and I'm going to tell this to everybody. I used to fast for years and years and years, and not strategically. It was an accident. I was an accidental faster, a chronic accidental faster. I would wake up
Mhm.
at 5 a.m. and have a espresso, and then I would train a whole bunch of clients outdoors. So I was also lifting and loading all of this kind of stuff in and out of my car. And then I wouldn't eat till like 7 or 8 a.m. until I'd had a break between clients.
Mhm.
Um, and so that was this fits in with my lifestyle. I don't want to get up at 4 a.m. to make breakfast. I'm just going to wait till 7, 8 a.m. Um, and so I have probably an elevated stress response from doing it because I did it for so long. But I remember at the time, it was like, well, it felt good. I mean, the coffee probably helped, but
Totally.
it felt really good. And I was really lean, and, I was pumped to train all my clients in the morning. I was just,
Mhm.
I was that trainer that was like, yeah, come on, let's go. And really like, yep, I wake up at 5 and I love it. But it's slowly over time. I reckon it's one of the biggest factors in my health today and struggling metabolically.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes a toll. And you're not tougher for being able to do it at that time. And not being able to do it now is not an indication that, you're lacking the mental toughness or that like physiologically you just can't handle it. And if someone can handle it, then it's going to help them. Instead, this is something that is universally stressful and will cause these sorts of harms and stress long term. And so we should feel bad when we do it. That's not a bad thing. Like we should
Mm,
notice that we normally feel really good. And when we go without eating, it makes us feel worse because our metabolic rate is turning down and we're being influenced by stress hormones. But if someone isn't feeling that way, that's probably a sign that what they were doing before was a lot worse, right? And so I think that's an easy, kind of simplified way to think about it is that if not eating your meal helps you feel better than eating your meal, then maybe we should look at what's in the meal. Maybe we should look at the actual food that you are eating, and maybe that, along with your digestion and your response to it, is more of the issue. Obviously, we're supposed to be eating food, so unless
mm.
someone were to think that we're literally not supposed to eat food, and I guess that's a different conversation. But assuming that we are, and eating makes you feel worse, maybe we should figure out why that is, what's going on, try to change things diet wise and gut wise, blood sugar wise, so that way you can feel good when you eat, as opposed to feeling worse.
And this can take time, right? And I
Totally.
think that's the thing, right? It's that finding out what really works for you takes time. And I don't have time, Jay. I want it now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's an issue with that, whether we're talking fasting or veganism or carnivore or any, I mean, even, with a bioenergetic approach, you can do the same thing too, right? You can take the broad recommendation of drinking a few liters of milk and a couple liters of orange juice and adding sugar to it and see how you go. And most of the time, it's still not ideal.
I'm sure
So,
I see a lot of problems with people who've done that too.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so, but I guess it's that it's when you say that, yeah, fasting increases your metabolism. It's like the same with the ice bath increasing your metabolism. I guess when you understand thermogenesis, maybe you could explain that a little bit because that might help people understand. So, yeah, because that's the theory behind ice baths, and right? If I really expose myself to the cold, I'm going to force my body to heat itself up. How is that? That sounds like sense to me. Like I get that.
yeah. Well, and it is there's that like there's truth there, right? The some of the direct things that happen when we do something like an ice bath, and it happens to be very similar to what happens when we fast, what happens when we do any sort of really intense, stressful activity. We activate a number of stress-induced pathways, one of which, and this one is especially activated when we use cold thermogenesis, is driving fat oxidation and uncoupling. And what uncoupling does is basically what I was describing earlier, where instead of having our car in drive, we press the gas pedal, the engine is, combusting the gasoline, and we're using that energy to move us forward. Instead, with uncoupling, we put it into neutral and then rev the engine. It produces a lot of heat as a byproduct, but we're not actually using that energy to go anywhere. And that's essentially what's happening with uncoupling, where we aren't actually producing ATP, so we aren't producing usable energy, but instead we just generate a lot of heat. And this is something that we do when we're cold or intensely cold or when we're under stress. Will induce uncoupling. It happens also when things are not working well in the engine and the mitochondria. We're forced to undergo uncoupling because it prevents things from getting too damaged. It's also something that happens like it's a part of like the shivering cold response that's seen. So that's one of the main mechanisms that we're generating heat, and it wastes a lot of fuel, it wastes a lot of calories, but it is doing so at a cost, at a metabolic cost, right? Our body is forced to divert fuel and potential energy to heat when it actually wants that energy for its brain and heart and lungs and digestion and everything else. And in order to make up for that, it signals that it needs to turn down its metabolic rate. And that's what happens long term.
Mm, that's the key thing to understand, I think, because it's confusing because you think, oh yeah, thermogenesis, body heat. I actually get a hot rush. I get a hot rush when I drink coffee when I'm fasted. I get a hot rush when I'm sitting in the ice bath or when I get out of the ice bath. That is really confusing.
Yeah.
And especially interesting, I guess, too, Jay. I don't know how many clients you have where they actually do a lot of this stuff and a lot of training and they actually do have okay body temperatures, but then they go on a holiday and they get really cold or they get
Mm.
sick. What's happening there?
Yeah.
Then
Yeah. It
they're
sounds
like,
like running on.
I can't live without my ice bath, and I can't live without my fasting, and I can't live without my training, and that's really what's keeping me performing really well.
Yeah. Well, I think the way that we normally talk about that is that someone who's running on stress hormones, right?
Yeah.
We're fueled on adrenaline and that gets us through the day. Typically, it will take us to a point where we crash eventually, or when we actually take away the intense stressors, we're left with a low metabolism, right? Our body temperature comes down, we're feeling pretty low, feeling tired. And sometimes that'll happen too, right? Well, if someone is in that place, they've been fasting, they're doing low carb, they're relying on these different biohacking interventions to get them, to give them their energy. Then they start to bring some carbohydrates in at the breakfast, stop doing such intense exercise, to find a better balance. And sometimes they'll feel a little tired, right? Their energy will actually go down for a little bit until their metabolic rate kicks back in because they've lowered the stress and they're not running on those stress hormones anymore. Normally, that also goes along with much better relaxation, much better sleep. typically when we're running on stress hormones, we have a lot of trouble relaxing. We have a lot of trouble getting good deep sleep and falling asleep. Of course, it's not always the case, but it's common. Typically, we're prone to cold hands and feet. It's another pretty common stress symptom. So there are normally some indicators there, but yeah, that's certainly a presentation that we can see for sure.
What about training when you're fasting? So I still eat at breakfast straight after training, but I train fasted. I still saw someone the other day saying that was better.
Then training not fasted or
Yeah,
then
you should always
okay.
train at before your first meal.
Yeah, it's like if our goal is burn as many calories as possible, induce stress to the extent that we can, get as much adrenaline as we can, as much fat burning as we can. If those are our goals, then yeah, training on an empty stomach, training when we're fasted will help us accomplish those goals. But I don't think those are very good goals. I don't think those are actually the things that lead to health. And I think that's where, a shift in thought process really makes a big difference, right? A recognition that the things that actually help support our health is decreasing the stress hormones, increasing our metabolic rate, getting our mitochondrial engines going to produce a lot of energy and not relying on stress. I mean, that's, I think, the like a big shift mindset wise. Um, and again, like talking about the burning of calories, and again, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. I don't know if we want to go down that route, but this idea that just burning more calories is all we need to do to lose body fat, and that's just the key to health, I think is also an area where we've kind of we're conflating things, right? We're choosing some outcome, but I don't think that outcome is actually representative, or that pathway of burning calories is actually representative or is actually going to get us to the outcome that we're looking for.
Mm. Well, I think it is good to touch on calories in versus calories out, that theory, because that it still is everyone's basic general theory, right? So, because even sometimes now people say to me, I can't believe how much food you eat, Leila.
Yeah.
Or because and Sean and I don't notice until we go on holidays with friends, or we feel like we're always like going, okay, guys, like it's lunchtime, we need to stop for lunch. And everyone looks at us like, why do you guys eat so much? You know?
Yeah, totally. Anytime I'm with family, always. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, why do you guys eat so much? And when you've worked as hard as I have, and you probably have, I don't know how hard it was for you after all the crazy things you do to restore function. Like, I'm super proud of my 2,300 calories a day. It's like, do you know how much work I had to do to be able to eat this much? um, it's such an interesting thing, right? And also, I guess too, because I still have weight to lose. So people probably look at me like, why do you eat that much when you still have weight to lose? Um, it's not as simple, right? Like, it's not healthy to be losing weight all the time. It's and and then I think I'll have so many clients and listeners listening and going, but I hardly eat anything and I'm overweight, right? And I see a
Exactly.
lot of that. I see a lot of that with people. And that's why I say when I worked up for those 2,300 calories, I'm really proud of myself, because there was one point when I was eating 1,600 calories and I was putting on weight. Calories in and calories out. I think we should touch on it a little bit, because if people still have that mindset, I could see how they could want to do all this biohacking.
Totally. Well, and so I think the example you brought up of the person who's really not eating very much, but they're very overweight or they're gaining weight, I think that's such it's very common, but it's also so sad to see what happens when somebody says that. The reflex from the calories in, calories out perspective is you're lying, or you don't know that you're
Mm,
lying, but you're lying. And you're eating more than you think you are, or you're not burning as much as you say you are. You're eating things that you're not tracking, you're not weighing it right, whatever it is. And yeah, it's so awful to have that assumption, as opposed to the idea that, well, actually, someone's metabolism can be downregulated. They're really not
mm,
burning very many calories, and maybe that's because their thyroid activity has been turned down dramatically from trying to go on intense diets in the past. And so there's a lot that goes into the equation and where I think it falls short. To maybe focus on some of the main ones. The first thing I'll say is I don't To equate calories to energy in a human physiological system, I think is not a starting place that makes sense. Um, the idea that we are just as likely to produce 4 calories worth of energy, which we don't produce energy in those terms. We produce ATP. We don't produce heat only. So the idea that we're going to produce the same amount of energy between spinach and steak and mangoes and donuts is skipping all of the physiology in between the like all the physiology that goes into what actually happens when we eat those foods. And so I think for not that it matters so much because at the moment calories are the best thing that we have, the best tool that we have to measure the amount of potential energy in the food that we're eating. But it's very much imperfect. In some ways, like some of the clear imperfections that I think at least most people can agree on is something like digestion, right? So just because the calorie comes into our mouth doesn't mean it actually makes it into our bloodstream, let's say. Um, and there's times where the calorie count that's on the bag of whatever you're eating could be off by 10, 20, 30% because of digestion. And there's some studies on, I think, almonds that was showing this, that because of how difficult they are to digest, a lot of the supposed calories in there don't get absorbed. And so that's going to throw off your calorie count by quite a bit. And not to mention in general, like most of the calorie counts are just based on estimations to begin with. And the amount that you absorb from something could be very different from somebody else, especially depending on our gut health and our gut bacteria and our stomach acid and our bile flow. So there's a number of things like that just when it comes to the calories in. When it comes to the idea of calories out, there's many things that can manipulate the calories out, which I think the people who fall in that camp say that that falls within the equation, right? Of course, hormones and sunlight and movement and sleep and everything else you can think of is going to affect the calories out, but it's still just a matter of calories in, calories out. And so, on one hand, I would say let's at least acknowledge all those things and recognize that it's nearly impossible to measure on a day-to-day basis all of the influences that are going to affect our supposed calories out, making it really difficult to have an accurate measure there to begin with. But the other thing too is this idea that there is just fuel coming in and energy out on the other end, and any excess, then it just gets stored as fat, is missing a lot of the complexities of our physiology, right? And so even if we skip everything that goes from calorie or potential energy to fuel or food to fuel, we want to skip digestion and skip all of that and the distribution of it and everything. Even then, when we are converting that fuel to energy, it's not a scenario where we just produce a maximum amount of energy from the food. And once we've hit that maximum, we've received all the energy that we need for our functions, the rest just spills over and becomes fat. Instead, there's direct hormonal regulation and redistribution of fuel that happens on a second to second basis based on tissues that are in need of energy or based on our energetic state. So, as an example, when we produce a lot of energy, we have a lot of ATP. It's going to help to turn down stress hormones and increase our thyroid hormone conversion, which will help us produce more energy, and that will help us with repair and regeneration, right? So tissues that need to be repaired, we might think of our muscle, but because that's often talked about, but every single tissue in our body goes through a lot of repair. The gut and skin are pretty well known for having a lot of turnover, and so all of that is going to require fuel and energy, right? Both the calories coming in that aren't actually used to produce energy, they're just used as structure, used as backbones, and then also the energy that's needed to create the cohesive structure out of the backbone. So there's that, like all of these other areas that extra fuel could go to that has nothing to do with increasing fat. There's, I guess, a lot of other nuance there, but I think the point that I'm getting at is if we are looking at things in such simplistic terms, I think we are missing out on all the things that we can do to increase the conversion from fuel to energy. And that's really where we want to focus, because what we actually find in people who are gaining body fat or dealing with degenerative issues or chronic health issues is that the conversion from fuel to energy is inefficient. It's not happening very well. And instead, and as a result, we're not getting the energy we need. We're not getting the ATP we need. and we're having excess fuel that then gets stored as body fat. And if all we're saying is we should just be eating less, we're going to end up with less and less energy, less and less ATP. So we're going to be feeling worse. We're going to have less energy for our day-to-day functions. We're going to be feeling hungrier. And yet we're still going to be storing body fat, or we might be storing a bit less, but in the long term, we're going to keep decreasing our metabolic rate. And that's exactly what we see as a result of the typical implementation of calories in, calories out is lower and lower metabolic rate over time, making it easier and easier to regain weight every time we do it, and harder to lose weight every time we do it. And we see that very clearly in the research, looking, for example, in rodent models, where they have them go through weight loss and regain cycles. And every time, sometimes I want to say it's like every time you do the cycle, it can be as much as 2 times harder to lose the weight and 3 times easier to regain the weight. They're pretty staggering numbers at how much our bodies adapt to major, yo-yo dieting essentially. And so many people have done that for years and years. I mean, that's their whole lives. And then they're stuck in a place where they're not able to eat very much. They're not feeling very good, and they're struggling to lose weight, or they're still gaining weight.
And even so as well, like for me, I was always really lean. And when I learned everything about nutrition in the fitness industry, it was all about weight loss. And I was like, well, I don't have any weight to lose.
Mm.
So I never paid attention to it properly, right? And actually eating for performance and putting on muscle and all that kind of stuff is actually quite a lot of knowledge to apply and strategy. So I think that we don't spend enough time teaching that to people as well. It's just everything is the focus of eat less, lose weight. And I really feel for people, because it happened to me as well, where someone was like, well, maybe you just need to eat less. And I was like, are you kidding? I'm not eating anything. If one more person tells me that, I'm going to scream. And I get clients like that. Doctors have actually said to them, maybe you just need to keep your hand out of the cookie jar. Like imagine saying that to a person.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. And I've literally done food logs with these people, and they are eating like 1,200, 1,400 calories. And they're like, I literally can't eat any less. And I'm like, of course you can't, you'll die. But this doctor of mine is saying, well, you obviously just have your hand in the cookie jar and you're not telling anyone about it.
Yeah. Well,
It's
and at
really
that point,
cruel.
once you get to, it's absolutely terrible. It's one of the most frustrating things to encounter that, and then just like prescribing SSRIs when the doctor can't figure out what's going on, or thinks that the patient's lying about whatever pain they're in or whatever issue they're dealing with. That one's up there as well. Not to say that all doctors do that, of course, but these sorts of experiences. Um, but yeah, no, it's terrible. And then what's supposed to happen, right? What I learned in my exercise physiology courses is that once you get down to a calorie level like 1,200 or 1,400, you're not supposed to keep restricting based on eating. You're just supposed to exercise more, because we need to at least get some nutrients in. So at that
Yeah.
point, you just got to start increasing those calories you're burning.
Oh my gosh, I really feel for these people.
Yeah.
It's crazy. But, I guess that is, and that's why so many people are wanting to try. They'll do anything. This is like, I literally can't eat anything less, so I will fast. People say to me about fasting, I'm like, you're already accidentally fasting anyway. Are you going to fast more? But they're desperate, because I'm like, I'm trying to lose weight and everyone's saying that it's just me. And so I'm going to do fasting. I'm going to quit carbs. I'm going to do ice baths as well. So I think there's that cohort of people as well, not just the people who are into the high performance. And
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And to think that like we're even having a conversation about eating 1,200 calories is it's so unfortunate, right? When we look back and see how much people were eating, 80 years ago, and that, 2,500 plus calories for an average woman, and 3,000 plus calories for an average man was normal, and an 1,800 calorie diet was considered semi-starvation. And now it's like that's a lot of calories.
I'm doing a fat loss phase at the moment. I'm eating 1,800 calories and I'm starving. I'm losing weight, but I'm starving. And it's funny, right? Because what I notice is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I just feel terrible. You can only do it for a certain amount of weeks before you start having declines in your physiology and your metabolism, and to so I then I when I in a fat loss phase, and I am looking at the way I feel and how much harder it is to train and how much harder it is to be patient with my daughter. And as the weeks go on, it gets worse and worse. I think about all these people who eat that little on a day-to-day basis and even less and think, well, no wonder they feel like crap. No wonder they don't want to have sex. No wonder they're angry with everybody. Right? Like it's totally understandable. And then I can totally get where they're like, I want to go do something extreme. I really just want to feel better.
Right. That's the solution that's being sold to feel better, of course. Yeah. I mean, there's no blame at all going to the people who are on carnivore, low carb fasting, using the ice baths. I mean, yeah, they're trying to feel good, of course.
Yeah. Well, this is a good one to talk about carnivore now, and low carb in general. I mean, there's variances of it, right? And I think what happens with people is they do low carb, they feel better, but then that stops. So then they go to keto, then they feel better for a while, that stops, and they go to carnivore. I have quite a few clients who are recovering carnivores actually. So this is
Oh, yeah.
something I really into, and carnivore is being promoted and as anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer. There's a lot of cancer patients doing carnivore. Um, I can see, and it's the research, I'm going to say in air quotes, is compelling when you read it. And I've had autoimmune, and people are like, why don't you just do carnivore? So and so did it, and it totally cleared up their rheumatoid arthritis or their Hashimoto's, or you can see it's really compelling. And when you're desperate, I can totally get it. But what is happening when we continually decrease our carbohydrate intake? What we're also doing with these diets, I think, is important to note, is that we're increasing our fat intake, and our fat intake's becoming a lot higher than our protein intake as well. Like there's quite a bit of nuance to that people aren't understanding either.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, what's happening physiologically when, let's say, we go low carb and keto, and then we'll talk carnivore in a second. But what's generally happening is we end up shifting our bodies from running mostly on glucose to running on fat and ketones. And when we compare how glucose and fat are burned and used in the mitochondria, fat is burned much less efficiently, produces a lot more reactive oxygen species per ATP that's produced. And as a result of this is relatively disfavored and slows down the speed with which our engine can run. It's like a worse quality gasoline. And because of that, there's a lot of hormonal regulation that goes on to indicate that we're in a suboptimal state, right? And this is very consistent evolutionarily in the idea that when we don't eat anything, we are running on our body fat, right? We start to run on fat, we start to run on ketosis, or we enter into ketosis. And this is well known that low carb diets mimic the fasting state or starvation state. And that's a state where, again, we don't have fuel coming in and we're running on fat. And it is the reason why our bodies choose to do it that way is because that has, as a less efficient fuel, it produces less energy and slows down the rate of respiration so that we can survive for a longer period of time. It's also a bit easier to store than glucose is. With that in mind, that signals that we're in a suboptimal state. It signals that we're in a state not of abundance, but rather of scarcity. And we see that in elevations in cortisol, especially in the first month or two, and then chronically high levels of glucagon where we're much more prone to high levels of epinephrine and cortisol as well. We also, as a result of that, then see an impaired conversion of the thyroid hormone. So we have much less of the active thyroid hormone T3. And farther down the line, we'll end up seeing a reduction in the reproductive hormones and things like that. And again, this is all in place to make sure that we don't die when we're starving, that we can survive for a longer period of time on this lower fuel, like this lower octane fuel, if you want to think of it that way. And we want to use less energy and favor less energetically expensive processes. So things like reproduction are going to be disfavored in a situation like that. We're not going to worry as much about things like skin, hair, and nails. We're not going to worry as much about energy and mood and all of that, but rather we're going to be in a lower energetic state. And so that's the general shift that happens. And of course, we're kind of getting at the ramifications of that. Now, oftentimes, there is, much like the intermittent fasting, the benefit that's happening at the same time in terms of a relief from endotoxin production from the gut, because a lot of the carbohydrates we eat are the foods that are going to feed the bacteria in the gut and lead to endotoxin production when our gut isn't healthy and we're not eating the right types of carbohydrates. So that can lead to someone feeling a lot better during that time. And then, as you said, very often they'll hit that point where things plateau or start to get worse, and they'll go deeper and then go from low carb to keto, and then potentially from something like keto to carnivore, at which point we're continually digging deeper and deeper into that stress hole. And so that's the kind of bigger or main concern there is the big picture direction, like where things head as the result of relying on our backup fuel system.
And also, I think what comes with that, with if I look back at my life with restricting carbohydrates, is you also end up restricting a lot of calories.
Yep.
And
Which
so
is that much worse.
is it, yeah. And so is it that you restricted carbohydrates that you lost weight, or is it also because you just pushed yourself further into a caloric deficit by nature of omitting an entire food group?
Yeah, and both can be at play for sure. And also, are you losing weight just because you've lowered endotoxin? And you could have done that without cutting out the carbohydrates.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. And then, of course, talk a little bit about the like later effects, because what I'm seeing with a lot of carnivore people is they have histamine, recovering now, trying to get back because they've hit that point where now they're histamine intolerant. Like I have a client, she cannot handle any histamines whatsoever. To restore her function, I'm basically giving her pure sugar because it's the only thing. And this is the thing, right? Sugar is so interesting. I find like when you read about Ray Peat restoring function with sugar, and I'm not saying to everybody you just go and hit the sugar. Like it's a very strategic way to do that. But we've become so anti-sugar. But the fact is that sugar is so absorbed so early in the digestive process. It's actually very low, a very low irritant, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So used appropriately with someone who has been not eating carbohydrates for a really long time, it can really be helpful and restorative.
Yeah, I mean, sugar is our most fundamental anti-stress substance, and there's some like really great studies looking at this, like even just taking the white sugar or table sugar like to the side for the moment, talking about histamine and allergic reactions. There are studies where they basically introduce an allergen to different rodents that will normally cause anaphylactic shock and death. And then they'll put them at different blood sugar levels and different insulin levels. And if they keep their blood sugar elevated, basically providing this constant high octane fuel to produce a lot of energy, there won't be any death when they then introduce the same allergen. The rats are totally fine, and they'll do it in a graded way where you see, as the blood sugar gets higher, there's more protective effects. And so, one of the best ways we can turn off the entire stress system, including cortisol, including histamine, including serotonin, including estrogen, is by providing carbohydrates. And I think it's one of the most profound experiences when people start to recognize that and realize how much better they can feel when they provide really easily digestible carbohydrates, and how immediately that can shift their mood and the way that they feel in their body and their ability to focus and things like that. So it's really powerful. And as you're getting at, table sugar is a really simple way to do that. Of course, it lacks some nutrition, but it's not going to be feeding any bacteria. It's not going to be contributing to any endotoxin production. And so it's like a pure fuel source in the same way that MCTs or butter are pure, or olive oil or coconut oil, anything like that is a pure fuel source with really very little nutrition in there. And yeah, it's totally fine in the right context. Of course, we can also get that sugar from sources like fruit and juice and potatoes and root vegetables and things like that. Depending on how we digest them and what kinds of choices we're making there, we might have different responses. But I think that's one of the more profound things. One of the things that really sticks out to me that made a huge difference in just my conceptualization of
Mm.
physiology and the world around me, was that recognition of sugar as an anti-stress substance.
It's crazy, right? Because for so many years it was told, and it still is said that it's bad, right?
Oh
And
yeah.
people say that it's bad. Sugar feeds pathogens, parasites, cancer, but how is that? How do we get to that confusing point where sugar feeds those things?
Yeah. Where I think if we look at all the things people say, we're very confused. But um, yeah, there's so for one, a fuel isn't bad because it's used by tissues, right? Like our livers use sugar, our brain uses sugar, um, it's just a fuel. And so if you have bacteria or fungus or something and you give it sugar, it'll use it. Um, and that's like there's truth there, but that doesn't mean that we are going to be encouraging the growth of those things in our bodies by consuming sugar. And so, as you were saying as an example, if we have an intestinal overgrowth, well, sugar should be a really good thing for us to consume because the chances of it hitting any sort of overgrowth in the large intestine should be zero. And even in the small intestine, we should be absorbing that sugar very, very quickly, very rapidly, and high up in the small intestine. So it shouldn't be hitting any bacteria or fungus unless we have some sort of major overgrowth, in which case we've got something else that we need to be working on anyway in that situation. But so I think I mean, it's made out to be the bad guy, the villain, and so it's then everything we do after that is like going through that lens, and so it's kind of pointed to as the bad guy. But it's a very similar situation with cancer as well, right? Where we have cancer cells which don't just use sugar as a fuel; they also use fatty acids, they also use amino acids, and that doesn't mean that amino acids cause cancer or that fatty acids cause cancer. It's just that this is a cell with a really deranged metabolism that is using a ton of fuel and it's really using it very, very inefficiently. When we look at the way that it's using glucose, it's converting it into lactate through glycolysis and it's not oxidizing it fully. And that's not something that we should be doing with sugar or a healthy tissue or healthy cell
Mm.
should be doing with sugar. And the cancer cell, there's a lot of unique features there. It ends up actually using that lactate as a building block for growth. Again, something that is not typically seen in other tissues. It's very metabolically deranged. It's also running on fatty acids and often amino acids as well at the same time. It basically has kind of it's a metabolically is very similar to deranged metabolism in any other disease process like fatty liver disease. Just as a clear example, or heart disease, you see it kind of in any of those where you have the glucose being used and converted to lactate through glycolysis. See this in insulin resistance as well. At the same time, you have fatty acids being used through beta oxidation and in the Krebs cycle. And you can also have some amino acids coming into the Krebs cycle as well, and that those are actually used as the primary fuels for energy in many of those cases. And the glucose is basically being wasted and converted into lactate. And then at the same time, you have things like uncoupling going on. And you see this in cancer too, in a lot of situations where you basically are running about as inefficient of energy production as possible and just flying through fuel. And yeah, it's to blame it on consuming sugar just requires a lot of leaps and yeah, mental
Yeah.
gymnastics.
But you do see people getting release, like or having less tumor growth when they've given up sugar, though. Like there is some research that's points that are some cancer patients currently who are coming into remission. Is it giving up the sugar though?
Right. So yeah, so it depends on a number of things. And there are certain like we don't want to generalize too much because the cancer cells there can be different types of deranged metabolism in different types of cancer. So in some cancers, they also are looking at things like fatty acid blockers to prevent them from utilizing fatty acids to help kill the cancer. So there are some unique aspects depending on the type of cancer, but there are, I think, a few things to consider. So one is that the removing sugar, as we're kind of getting at, as we talked about with low carb diets and whatnot, is not just removing sugar, it's removing a lot of things, a lot of potentially harmful foods, and also the feeding of bacteria and endotoxin, which is implicated in any degenerative state you can come up with that drives oxidative stress and deranged metabolism, impairs the function of the electron transport chain, which is these are all things that you see in a lot of different forms of cancer as well. So I think you can get a huge amount of relief from that. There are, again, maybe some other unique scenarios where after you're at that point, like it can work to starve the cancer, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like the ideal
Mm,
way to go about it. Now there's some intricacies there, but I guess what I would say is it is nowhere near as simple as carbohydrates can cause the deranged metabolism that is seen in cancer.
mm. And I think too, like with anything, when I'm looking at research as well, I will always say to anyone who's reading it or myself, well, what were these people doing before? What were they
Totally.
eating
Yeah.
before? When they say this causes weight loss, okay, well, the people they tested it on, what were they eating every day before? All these people who have cancer and now their cancer's into remission because they gave up sugar, but what were they actually eating before? Like, what was their entire diet like? If it was the standard American diet, which I think we can also call this almost standard Australian diet, what is that giving up sugar or is it not eating the standard Australian American diet?
Totally. Yeah, of course. And it's also worth mentioning too, there's again, in certain unique types of cancer, there can be benefits to something like a ketogenic diet. As we're getting at, there can be a lot of reasons for benefits of the ketogenic diet that are not due to just the restriction of carbohydrates, right? But more so endotoxin and also relief from poor glucose oxidation. But we want to fix the glucose oxidation at that
Mm,
point. But it's also not something that is a cure-all for cancer at all. There are situations where it can provide benefits, but it's nowhere near as simple as ketogenic diet means no cancer or ketogenic diet means cancer is gone.
yeah. And then it's also what happens afterwards. I think this is a key. I mean, like you say, and I have that with many clients as well, there is a purpose for giving up certain types of carbohydrates, lowering carbohydrates for a period of time, but then it's a very strategic process to reintroduce carbohydrates, the right carbohydrates, increase the amount of carbohydrates over time. And it's a very strategic process. So again, I think you could almost say that going pro-metabolic is like the latest biohacking thing, we should put that in there. We've got people who are like, oh, I saw that Ray Peat said orange juice is really good for you, or milk is really good for you. I'm just going to go all in with the milk and juice. And they feel amazing, right? To start off with. Because everybody's like, oh my God, you've been starving me for all these carbohydrates. But then in a few weeks or a bit later, people are coming to me and they're like, oh, well, I put on like, I don't know, 30, 50 pounds. I now have exercise intolerance. All of these kind of things when it must be, again, it's all the sugar. um, I mean, how is that happening? That's always an interesting one to talk about too.
Yeah, I don't think that's a great approach, right? Um, in general, for most people, I wouldn't start there. I wouldn't, I think my approach, my preference when it comes to shifting over is to do it gradually, incrementally, to be very careful about the kinds of things we bring in. As an example, milk, while it's a great food, can also be really hard to digest food. A lot of people have issues breaking down the lactose. And if you're not breaking down the lactose well, it means it's going on to feed bacteria and increasing endotoxin. Some people, fewer people, have issues breaking down or not breaking down, but have reactions to the casein or to the whey, and that can contribute to issues as well. Um, and so when it comes to bringing something in like dairy or specifically milk, I think it's something we would want to do very, very carefully and make sure that we're digesting it well, we're not having negative effects. And same thing when it comes to carbohydrates. I think going from 0 to 100 is uh, going to leave us much more prone to making mistakes, right? Slowly trying one thing at a time, bringing in some carbohydrates that we should be able to digest very easily, maybe certain types of fruits and juice, in moderate amounts, see how we feel, slowly tweak and make changes. And otherwise, it's really easy to make a lot of mistakes. And we don't always realize that they're mistakes at the time, but then, you know, they're talking with us later on and they're like, oh, I'm actually doing way better now with a bioenergetic approach. It's just that I had to kind of take some steps back, fix up some of those underlying issues and change up some of the food choices. But yeah, I would say I prefer the slow and steady approach in most cases, or at least a little bit more careful approach, and
Mm,
especially when it comes to something like something like milk. Like I think we want to be very measured with that.
100%. And this is where like food logging comes in. That's really key because you really want to measure. Like if someone comes to you, I've had clients that literally eat 20 grams of carbohydrate every day. You can't go from 20 grams to 300 grams of carbohydrate just because that's what, they need if you look it up on the TDE.net calculator.
Right.
It's a very, very strategic process. Sometimes, as little as 25 grams of carbohydrate a month, 2 weeks, depending on increasing that slowly, depending on what someone can handle and the types of carbohydrates, right? Like people forget that what a beneficial carbohydrate is fruit, like whole, ripe fruit, and just starting with fruit. People always think of it as and I think that's a big problem too, right? When people say I cut carbs and I feel better, it's basically because they had a grain-based diet and not thinking about all the other carbohydrates.
Yeah, grain and starch based for sure. And again, some people do really well with starch. Sometimes it can be contributing to gut issues or blood sugar regulation issues. So yeah, and even with fruit, right? There are certain fruits that are really easy to digest and other ones that are really fibrous, have a lot of fermentable carbohydrates in there. And if our gut is not in a great place, that could potentially cause an issue. Long term, we want to be able to eat those. We want to be able to have a good, healthy microbiome and shouldn't have an issue if we're feeding it with, some of the fermentable carbohydrates from fruit. But there's certain ones that we might need to be a bit more careful with. So,
Mhm. I think another important thing to look at too, that maybe you can touch on when you look at a study and it says people lost weight doing this.
mhm.
Let's just talk
Yeah,
about the nuances of losing weight.
sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that come to mind. For one, it's always important to look if the data is available on fat-free mass versus body fat loss. So in some studies and some of the big ones right now that it should be being talked about, I don't think they are very much, is with the new drugs, the Wegovy and Ozempic and all of those. They do tend to cause a lot of weight loss, but they cause a lot of lean mass loss.
Mm.
Um, relative to body fat. And that's really not ideal. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people will regain a ton of weight when they get off of those, but one of them is having lost a lot of lean mass, losing a lot of muscle. Definitely not something we want to be doing. And so that's one thing to look at for sure. And there's, when it comes to weight loss, one thing that I think is, again, maybe not acknowledged as much as it should be, but it's pretty well known is that diets in studies tend to work very well short term, but long term tend to work very poorly, right? And people will blame the individuals not being able to stick to it, and they just are eating more than they say, and all of that. But in any case, um, the long term effectiveness of diets is pretty low based on the people who are just generally trying diets. So that's always something to keep in mind as well.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one. I think you talked about it once. And I did have a look at the study where they took a bunch of athletes and put them on intermittent fasting. And what happened to those athletes?
Yeah, there's a couple of studies on intermittent fasting showing decreased testosterone, decreased T3, and loss of lean mass relative to body fat and relative to other groups where they'll lose more body fat and less lean mass. Um, yeah, definitely telling for sure.
Yeah, so if we're looking at different groups that participate in studies, we can really start to see the nuances of what works or not. I mean, I've had so many people like, oh, I did intermittent fasting and I lost like 8 kilos. And I said, well, I lost 8 kilos eating food and weight training. So it's important to look at, you know, if you're, and that's something you can test easily with yourself, right? You can get a DEXA scan before you do the protocol, get a DEXA scan after, rather than just looking at your scale weight. Well, what did I actually lose when I did that fat loss phase?
Definitely. Yeah, yeah, and the things like intermittent fasting, things like large calorie deficits, it's really common to lose lean mass. Um, Also, not only intermittent fasting, but like 3, 4 day fast. There's certain prominent health figures that would suggest those things, and then over many years of telling people to do that, then realize that it caused a lot of lean mass loss. So yeah, it's something to be aware of for sure.
And I think it's also like having a context of body composition in your mind. Because I work with a lot of women, and they will tell me they're happiest with the way they look when they have a really low body weight.
Sure.
And often they will have had a DEXA scan and they'll just focus on the percentage of the fat. They'll say, well, I have 30% fat and it should be 20, so I need to lose weight.
Mm.
But we've got to come back to simple maths at that point. 30% of 100 and 30% of 60 are two different, very different
Sure.
numbers. So we have to actually look at the simple maths and say, well, okay, if you're, for me, for example, if I'm 5'9" and I'm 65 kilos and I have 30% of body fat, I'm actually not overweight. I'm under muscled.
Mm.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
65 kilograms at 5'9", I don't know what that is in pounds, is actually a perfect body weight for someone my height. And if you're getting, especially you go to gyms and they do those body scans in the gym and they say, oh, you have 30% body fat, that's too much, you have to lose weight. And I have to be honest and say it's so much easier as a trainer to get someone to lose weight than to help them put on muscle mass. So it's a
Yeah.
sales
It's slower.
process.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
you
Muscle,
know,
like building muscle takes time, it takes effort and energy, and yeah, for sure.
so they're going to get more results more quickly with you. And also it's easier for them because they can just, if you're metabolically flexible, they can just focus on the whole calories in versus calories out. So they tell you to eat less and then they just flog you and then you're in your session. Um,
Yeah.
and this
Yeah,
is
they got to
part of,
track on
yeah,
MyFitnessPal, everything that goes in and keep lowering those calories. Oh yeah.
yeah. And then they just keep pushing you hard in your session. So it's really easy to see how people fall into this trap of, well, I just have too much body fat and I need to flog myself rather than, okay, how much muscle mass should I have though? And really, what is a healthy body weight for me? And I find with women, and I don't know about you, find I don't coach a lot of men, but the men that I do coach are the same. It's like, no, you actually need to be heavier. You need to have more muscle mass. And maybe this is a good point here to talk about because to me, having more muscle mass is the ultimate biohack.
Yeah. Well, and it does make it easier to lose the body fat too. Um, yeah, I think there can be, we can have too much too. So that's my hesitation is it's
Oh
not
yeah,
something where
yeah,
it's
we
like,
can have too much, but yeah, I mean
yeah,
for the
and
general
just,
population though,
and there's also the situation too that I just want to again throw out as a caveat is just because somebody has a lot of muscle doesn't mean that they are also healthy.
no,
Um, Even if it's not too much, they can still have like a good physique and everything, but be dealing with a lot of health issues. So I always want to just create some separation because I think speaking of this social media age, right, it's so easy to get wrapped up in whoever it is that has showing you their six pack on Instagram and saying, follow this program so you can do the same, but that doesn't mean that it's going to support your health.
yeah.
Uh, so wanted to make that distinction. But sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, no, 100% I agree because there's actually someone that I've been following on Instagram and she's in her 50s and she's going on about this whole transformation that she's had. She learned how to count macros and she learned how to weight train and she looks amazing. But when you follow her for a while, and this is what I say to people, when you watch someone in Instagram, social media, like actually watch them, like actually see what they're doing, what they're saying, how they talk about their life, like not just their eating and their like their training program and their physique. Like actually look at, so this woman was starting to talk about how she's having perimenopausal hair loss and she's going to go and have some kind of treatment for that. To me, that's a massive red flag. Okay, so she has muscle mass and she has a great physique and yeah, she counts her macros and all those things. But when you actually look at their macros, they're actually pretty empty in terms of vitamins and minerals. They're really lacking in vitamin A, all these kinds of things. So she's still not exactly healthy. She looks amazing. She's able to keep her weight and her body composition in a really good place. And so I don't want to discredit her in any way because she's worked really hard for that physique in terms of training and really consistently food logging and hitting those macros. But at the same time, when she's sitting there talking about how she's going to go and get, I don't even know what that process is where you get, I don't know, that it's becoming quite popular now where you get some kind of, it's being targeted at women with perimenopause and stuff, losing your hair, and there's some treatment where they stimulate the hair follicle or something. And of course, it's expensive. Again, I hate it when people are told they need to do expensive things. We need to be questioning, okay, well, why is her hair falling out?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, is that really healthy?
Right. Well, and that's where you're getting at, right? Is body composition can happen as the result of health, but it can also come at the cost of health. And there can be major digestive issues. There can be hypothyroidism. There can be hormonal dysregulation of other sorts. There can be skin issues, all sorts of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. But I guess in the context of eating a diet that is rich in minerals, being able to eat a really good amount of calories, and as a result of putting muscle mass on from that, to me, that's like the ultimate longevity. Like, what is it about muscle that keeps us young and metabolic? And because a lot of these biohacks like fasting and all that actually deplete our muscle.
Yeah. It's so I don't know. Part of my like there it's tough to separate out a couple of things, right? So loss of muscle mass is something that's going to be associated with aging, with high stress, with low pro-metabolic hormones, right? Like low testosterone for men. And on the female side, we're talking, progesterone doesn't have a major contribution as far as muscle goes, but you can have low testosterone on that side too. We're talking especially excess catabolism, right? Excess cortisol. And so losing muscle over time or like having low muscle is going to be associated with worse health for sure. I also don't think muscle itself is magic, right? Like it's helpful. It's good to be able to build muscle, right? That is a sign of a really good metabolic state. And if we are spending a lot of time in the gym and we're not building muscle, then I think that's a sign that things might be off. And that was me for a long time when I was younger. I spent years working, very, very consistently at the gym, more consistently than anyone else that I knew, especially at my age. But the other people who I knew at the gym, and they would go to McDonald's after or Wendy's or whatever it was. They'd be eating all sorts of stuff, and I was eating quote unquote healthy. And yet they would be getting bigger and stronger at a faster rate than I was. That was something that I saw very clearly. And it wasn't until many years later when I realized that I was really intensely undernourished, and really increased the carbohydrates, increased the calories a lot. And I gained a lot of muscle in a very short period of time and a lot of strength too. I was, doing powerlifting at the time and things like that. And was more than 30 pounds heavier than I am at the moment, with a lot more muscle, which wasn't something that was conducive to other goals of mine that I had, but that's beside the point. So being able to build muscle from a stimulus is a good sign. It's a sign that our stress hormones are low, that we're in a good thyroid state, a good pro-metabolic state. So I'd say that's really important. And it also can make it easier to lose body fat, but I also don't think it's particularly magical when it comes to our health.
It's a part of it. It's not the whole picture. And I think that's, all the thing. But what I love about having put on muscle, I think I put on about 7 or 8 kilos of muscle. And a lot of that would have just been from replenishing glycogen. And then actually training, put on a little bit more, is that, it is so much easier to lose weight. so much easier. So, you don't have to give up. I mean, yes, you do give up some carbohydrate when you do a fat loss phase. You do push yourself into a lower carb state. But I can still eat, 200 grams of carbohydrate and lose weight. I don't have to eat 0 carbs to lose weight. Um,
And that's high carb by today's
yeah, that's
standards,
high
even though.
carb. Yeah, I know. I'm like, I'm doing low carb, everyone. Actually, I think I'm like 160 grams of carbohydrate at the moment, and all I can think about is getting back to my 300 grams of carbohydrate.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's just so interesting to me, that of not having to deprive yourself is a pretty amazing feeling. Like realizing that fuel is actually a biohack. Giving yourself more sleep is a biohack. Giving yourself more carbohydrate, giving yourself more protein. There's just so many other things. And they're not like, oh, I have to go, like for me as a mom too, like to go and make an appointment to ice bath every week, or I actually like to sauna, committing to those things takes a lot of time and money that, time I don't necessarily have. But the joy of like logging and increasing all my minerals and nutrients over time and then watching how that affects my training, it's phenomenal. Like you said, when you increase it, it's like, it's amazing when you actually track your training, you stick to a program and you put progressive overload in and you look at your higher carb phases and you're like, oh my God, I can push so much more weight when I'm eating more carbs. I can recover so much faster from a workout when I'm eating more carbohydrate. Like, that's incredible to me from someone who used to just be like, oh, I live on adrenaline and I feel amazing.
Yeah.
But I actually didn't get very far with my training goals and my performance goals. It's like there was always this glass ceiling that I could never get over with, for instance, with my muscle ups. I could do a few, but I could just never get to 10, Why can't I get to 10? I'm just doing it as hard as I possibly can and I can't get to 10. And everyone's going to have different goals, right? I always say this to my clients, like they follow Kitty or Libby and some of these girls that really do a lot of work in the gym and put on muscle mass. That's not for everybody. That level, that's not for me. Like I have other things I want to do with my life, but even just putting on 1 or 2 kilos of muscle mass can make a massive difference to your physiology and rather than always focusing on the scale weight and losing scale weight and just be brave enough to just weigh a little bit more. You don't have to tell anyone, nobody will know. Like I used to work in retail and I remember this woman came in, she was like, she was so offended that she had to wear a different size. And I was like, well, just cut the tag off and don't tell anyone. Like, why do we get so hung up on these things?
Yeah. Yeah. Seriously.
But men are the same though. And I've had a lot of male clients who are really into the ice bath and the fasting and and they, say things like, oh, I lost a lot of fat, but I still have a squidgy belly, or I still have, these little bits. It's like, and I train and I can't put muscle on, right? So that there comes a point where you're like, oh, this actually isn't working.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And that's exactly what we're getting at, right? Getting into a better energetic state where we're actually able to put on muscle. We're not constantly catabolizing, constantly breaking down our muscle because we're chronically stressed, right? And we were talking earlier about providing carbohydrates, and that's one of the areas that we'll do, like that we'll get it from is our muscle when we're not providing the carbohydrates from our diet. So yeah, it's I think a really important part of the equation for sure.
100%. Yeah, I really hope that people can have a look at what they're doing and test if it's really working. So what would you say are some good ways to test? We touched on the temperature and pulse.
Yep.
Like what would you suggest? Are these things actually working for me? And then, what are your suggestions for a good baseline for increasing metabolic energy and flexibility? And
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that we can evaluate where we're at. I think taking an inventory of how we feel on a day-to-day basis is a really helpful starting place, right? How many hours of sleep do we get per night? How many times do we wake up? How long does it take us to fall asleep? How's our energy during the day? Do we have dips in the afternoon? How's our digestion? Are we aware that we're digesting our food, or is it something that is just perfectly smooth and easy? Do we have bloating? Do we have gas? How often are we going to the bathroom? Um, how's our mood, right? Do we have a short temper? Do we have a short fuse? Um, are we anxious? Do we have joint pain? Do we have dry skin? Like looking at every aspect of how we feel and just taking an inventory and then using something like temperature and pulse as well. A lot of times people like some objective measures, so those can be helpful too. And that can give us a baseline and that can be really helpful, right? Pretty much anything I said, we don't want to be there, right? We want to be sleeping through the night. It should be very easy to fall asleep. Our nails and hair should be growing nice and long and thick and easily, and on from there. And so I think that we can then monitor those things day to day, week to week, and see how they change. And I think that's normally going to be the best. It's my preference, not necessarily meaning that it's at the exclusion of looking at a blood test or something like that. Obviously, blood tests can be helpful too, but using our symptoms can help give us information on a day-to-day basis that what we're doing is helping us and heading in the right direction, or is like maybe we're missing something and we need to make some tweaks. And yeah, so I think it can be really informative, very empowering. And then we can also at points look at blood work and get an idea of our thyroid values and reproductive hormones and vitamin D and you know, checking the liver enzymes, like all the different areas, make sure things are looking okay there. But yeah, I think our goal is to feel good, right? Regardless of any numbers on the paper or even what the thermometer says. Of course, we want that to go up too, but our goal more than anything is to feel good in every way. And so I think that should be that should be at the forefront of what we're using to gauge our like whether what we're doing is working for us. So that's normally my recommendation there.
Mm. I think too, like one of the things I always think of, I like how Josh Rubin says you should always wake up feeling happy, hungry, and horny. Not horny every day, but generally. But I also like to say, like, well, I also like to wake up knowing that I need to have a bowel movement first thing in the morning, or pretty soon after
Sure.
breakfast. Just some simple things like that, like being hungry. People have always thought it's a bad thing to
Yeah.
be hungry, like you need to push down hunger.
Yeah,
Like,
no, that's such a good one to mention. I mean, I mean, pretty much anything improving is going to track with people getting better, but having a strong appetite, especially in the morning, but throughout the day too, is something that when I see that turn on for people, tends to go alongside healthy weight loss, much better energy, like a lot of other things tend to improve when we're seeing that improve.
yeah. And obviously you shouldn't need to eat like every 2, 3, 4 hours. You should be able to go between meals. But when you come to a meal, you should be like, I want to eat this. I'm hungry for
Yeah.
this. And like waking up hungry. Like I wake up starving every morning. I'm like I'm 7 o'clock. I'm like, I need to eat.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Like,
especially now.
yeah, yeah. And especially now, I did have a snack. And that's the thing, right? I got up really early to do this podcast. I have a snack. I would never do anything fasted anymore.
Yeah.
Even do a podcast interview about a topic that I love that I'm really excited about. I still wouldn't do that fasted.
Yeah,
Um,
you need energy for that too.
what do you think are some of the things that are really helpful? Because, for instance, heat can be quite helpful. Saunas, red light. Like, what are some of the things that are helpful that you're us, seeing working with clients or yourself that we
Just
could
in
call a
general, or like
biohack? I just
biohacking.
don't know. Yeah, I guess like biohack. I mean, to me, for instance, like, so many people don't get enough sunlight because they're on a computer all day. They're exposed to massive amounts of blue light. I don't like to call those things biohacks. I always just like to call them that something to just counteract and balance out.
Totally.
What are the things are you suggesting to people?
Yeah. So, I mean, assuming we've got our foundations in place, which I think 90+% can often be that, right?
Yeah.
Are we getting enough of the right nutrients in? Are we eating frequently? How's our digestion? How's our sleep and sleep habits? I mean, I think those are the most important. But when we're talking about extras or yeah, some more specific things that might help in a certain situation. I mean, I think red light can be really beneficial for healing injuries, healing tissue that hasn't healed right prior, or for just a general kind of metabolic boost. It does help to increase our capacity for energy production. So red light can be helpful on. I think our best source of red light is the sun, as you were kind of alluding to. That sunlight, I think, is really, really important. But if we're not able to get sunlight, especially during the hours when the sun is the strongest, then using red light and maybe a vitamin D lamp can help, especially in the winter in places where, it's cloudy and gray
Mm.
for 6 months. Um, vitamin D lamp can be helpful. So I think both of those are tools that someone might want to think about, but sunlight can be massively beneficial. So I think that would be my preference is just getting
Mm.
regular sunlight. Um,
Even just walking without your sunglasses on. I
yeah,
could go for a walk at, you know, I go for a walk at 7, 8 in the morning and everyone's got their sunglasses on.
really.
And we take for
Yeah,
granted that you actually need that sun
it's
light
so
to
weird.
hit
I
your.
haven't thought about sunglasses in forever. Nobody wears sunglasses here. Like
Oh,
I'm not in the
really?
States. Yeah. I can't think of the last time I saw someone wearing sunglasses.
I
Um,
really purposefully try not to wear them before 10 a.m.
yeah.
And after 3. Like I really try and make sure that I actually get my eyes in the sun. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, getting that light in the morning can be really helpful for setting your circadian rhythm. It can help with sleep the next night. I've certainly seen that happening. Um, yeah, having a walk in the morning, getting some sunlight and yeah, getting the stimulation in your eyes can definitely help. And with that, I mean, speaking of light in our eyes, most of the light that people are getting all day is just straight, really strong blue light without any of the other wavelengths to help balance it out. And often with a lot of like flicker as well, which can be
Mm.
really intensely straining on the eyes. Not to mention, most people are also looking at screens that are maybe a foot in front of them most of the day. So there's a lot of things that can be done for that, different apps and things that you could get on your screens to lower the blue light, to prevent the flicker. You can make a point to not just stare right at the screen, but uh, at least every hour, like you spend some time looking far away and, looking at things at different distances, getting outside for sure, getting the light in your eyes. I mean, there's such a difference between like even bright lights inside and then going out and getting like sunlight in your eyes. So yeah, I think light's definitely an important one. And we could talk about breathing as well. You have the
Mm.
the breathing biohacks of things like Wim Hof breathing, which I think are generally not good ideas, just like uh,
Well,
ice
that goes
baths,
with the
right?
ice
But
bath.
yeah, totally. And it's a really great way to increase stress and cause hypoxia. That's how it increases the stress. And that's been shown in the studies looking at it. And instead, we really want to do the opposite. We don't want to cause hypoxia, but we want to increase our oxygenation. And the best way to do that is by increasing how much CO2, carbon dioxide, we retain. And there's a number of breathing techniques that are focused on that. Buteyko is I think, the most prominent one that's heavily focused on that. So I think that's always something that's worth exploring. Um,
Have you used
you were talking
bag
about
breathing
heat.
with clients?
I've never done it
I know
personally or really
Tomo is
suggested
quite,
it. I think it's, go ahead.
I think Tomo is quite, has had a lot of success with it. Bag breathing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And same idea, right? Just a technique to increase
Mm.
our carbon dioxide. Yeah. So bag breathing could work or Buteyko breathing. And I think the bag breathing probably works better when someone's in an intense situation and it could be harder to
Mm.
um, do something like Buteyko.
Mm.
But yeah, I think those are great ideas. You're talking about heat. So instead of cold thermogenesis, I would definitely prefer the heat side. Doing something like a sauna, I think can be generally beneficial and good for detoxification systems and circulation and also for getting the metabolic rate up in a non-stressful way. Of course, with that in mind, the caveat is let's not overdo it, right? We're not trying to cause stress with this. So that's something we want to be aware of. But yeah, saunas can help. Again, I think the sun is a really good sauna if we're in a warm place. But
Yeah. I really like saunas and I found them quite beneficial doing those. But I think also like the main thing to note is that sometimes, I've seen people can get addicted to things or really think that something is life changing, like doing coffee enemas or saunas and I think there are places for all these things. But a lot of the time it's because they left their house, they left their family, and they went and just did something by themselves and no one interrupted them. And like I noticed that, especially because I work with so many women, that we really have trouble saying no to everyone and just taking time for ourselves. So when you actually physically make an appointment, pay for a sauna and go and sit in the sauna by yourself, I think that's a huge part of it as well, because you created that boundary and sat there and did nothing for 40 minutes.
Yeah, hopefully without your phone and without much in the way of stimulation or input. I mean, and that's rare these days too, right? I think like, we could talk about structured time like that, like meditation, I think can be beneficial, but also unstructured time where, speaking of hacks, like turning off all the technology or keeping it
Mm,
away and just doing something and letting yourself get bored, I think is
mm.
a really good hack for, I think it can help a lot with anxiety, especially for someone who, your head hits the pillow at night and your mind is racing. Assuming that there's not stress and we're addressing like the physiological side, are you giving your mind time to process things during the day? Are you letting yourself get bored? I think it can help a lot with the emotional side of things. I think it can also help with like creativity a lot. I think we forget that we can create our own ideas when we don't get
Oh,
bored. Like
yeah.
when we're bored, then we start to think about things and think about things in different ways and examine the world around us and look through it through different angles and lenses. And I think it's easy to get used to being given the ideas from whatever input as opposed to actually generating them. So yeah, I think getting bored is um, high on my list of biohacks.
Well, I think that's an interest. I really share that philosophy, and I actually really point that out to clients because I think that it's a lot harder to sit with yourself and be bored than for some people than sit in the ice bath and push yourself to breathe through the pain, right? Because when you
Yeah.
have that pain of sitting in the ice, you have something to focus on. And so some people are addicted or constantly need something to focus on, be it pain of
Yeah.
training, be it something other than just I'm just going to completely empty myself and be bored. Like they're so uncomfortable with being bored.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a disservice to us on a psychological level. Like it's not, I mean, there's something to be said for like taking a break and as opposed to the go, go, go sort of thing, but being able to be quiet with yourself and in your mind, I think is a really valuable skill. And
Mm,
I think it's an interesting point, right? That one of the things, like not like forgetting the physiology of something like an ice bath, I do think an area where it can be hypothetically beneficial is kind of what you're getting at. Like it can force you to be present. A lot of us are not present, maybe at all, throughout the day. We're going from one thing to the next. We're constantly in communication with everyone around us. We're constantly getting inputs from social media, um, podcasts, whatever it is, TV, news. And so to have a moment where not only are you not doing anything else, but you are physically forced to be present, I think
mm.
is really valuable. It just as we're kind of getting at, let's maybe do it without all the stress. But yeah, I think that uh, is important not to overlook.
Yeah. And even just like the amount of clients that I've had who have had such a profound change just going for a walk every day without talking to someone on their phone, without looking at their phone, just even not even listening to a podcast sometimes. For some people, they
Mhm.
just can't switch off. Like they actually just need to put some classical music on, have no music, just focus on your breathing. That for some of my clients has been the most profound biohack for one, since we're talking about biohacking, it's just like doing a 10-minute walk after every meal, looking at nature for balancing
Mm.
blood sugar, you know, being present, like, and I always think the best ones are the free ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and the simple ones and the yeah, no, I think walking is a really great biohack and yes, walking after meals can be great for blood sugar, it can be helpful for digestion too if we're doing it gently as opposed to sitting and constricting, our abdomen, but also yeah, the psychological side, the mental side, getting outside, getting in the sun, clearing our heads. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and breathing is a big one as well. Even just in training, getting clients to, especially doing zone 2 or steady state cardio with your mouth closed.
Yep.
That's a huge, I've had so many women who have hot blushes in menopause and start implementing some sort of increase of carbon dioxide retention, like mouth breathing, just walking. I mean, some women find it really hard to have to actually tape their mouth while they're walking or cycle, like on a stationary bike doing zone 2, and they have gotten rid of their hot blushes just from implementing some nasal breathing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great one. And I mean, even just like balancing blood sugar can be huge for those hot flashes as well. And so often it's just the cortisol spikes with the background of high estrogen and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean and that's something, the nasal breathing, the increased carbon dioxide retention can help a lot with sleep, can help with migraines and headaches, can definitely help with reducing stress overall. And it's going to reduce the intensity of the stress of whatever we're doing, right? It's going to reduce the stress caused by the exercise that we're doing. And yeah.
Well, I hope this inspires you all to think more simply about changing our physiology doesn't have to be as intense or as expensive or as full on as we think. It's often the simple things. I hope this inspires you. I really encourage you all to go and listen to Jay's podcast if you haven't, his Energy Balance podcast. And particularly the first series of your podcast is such a really basic, really easy and to understand and well-explained basis of the foundational principles to restore your metabolism. It's such a great, I often recommend that to people. It's such a great series, your first podcast series. But how can people work with you? What can they do to get in touch with you? What have you got for my listeners so they can implement what they've learned today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we didn't talk as much about, we talked about carbohydrates being important and things like that, but we didn't dig into as many details diet-wise. So if listeners are interested in a starting place for that, I have what's called the Energy Balance Food Guide. It's a one-page infographic and goes through foods in all sorts of different categories based on how effectively they support your metabolism. So there's different scales for all the foods, and there's also a separate scale for you to use in the case that you're dealing with digestive symptoms, which we talked about a decent amount. So certain foods you want to be a bit more careful with if you have overgrowths, and certain ones you want to favor. So that one-page infographic, the Energy Balance Food Guide, can be found at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. And I've got a bunch of other free content on my website, links to articles and podcasts and the programs and services that I offer, courses and group coaching and one-on-one coaching and all of that. So.
Well, thanks so much, Jay. I just love having you on. You're so knowledgeable. You really back up what you say with the research. And my audience loves you. So thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
I'm Leila Lutz, and you've been listening to The Body Never Lies. If you haven't yet, please go to your favourite podcast app and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. All the resources and references from this episode are waiting for you on my website, leilalutz.com. Just click on podcast and look for this episode. Now join me next week for another episode of The Body Never Lies. Thank you so much for listening.